Good morning. Great to be here, folks. Thank you for making it out first thing in the morning after what was probably a fun night. And hopefully we won't let you down. We've got a really smart group of thinkers here to discuss foreign policy, the future of foreign policy, future of multilateralism, and on and on and on. We've got a lot to cover, so at times it might feel a little bit like speed dating, but hopefully we'll be disciplined and we'll get through a whole bunch of topics. We're really thrilled to have a great group of speakers with us today. I'll quickly introduce them all. First, Melissa Landsman. Melissa is Member of Parliament for Thornhill, Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. Also, in my opinion, and I am a professional communications analyst, in my opinion, hands down, one of the ablest communicators that the Conservative Party has. So, welcome, Melissa.
It's a good thing you guys are smart.
She's a first-term MP, fluent in English, French, and Russian, a U of T alum, and also both pre-election and post-election one of the most highly sought political commentators in Canada. She's also someone I'm honored to be able to call a friend. So really thrilled you're with us today.
It's good to be here.
All right. Kaveh Shahrouz. Kaveh is a lawyer, human rights activist, and a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And by the way, let's hear it for MLI, who does phenomenal work. At MLI, Kaveh focuses on foreign policy generally, but with a particular specialization in Iran. A former senior policy advisor with Global Affairs Canada, he has advised on international human rights, and his work has appeared in print in the Wall Street Journal, Politico EU, The Globe, and The Post. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School, which means he's really freaking smart. All right. Glad you're with us.
Thank you so much.
Surajit Singh. Suraj is a Juris Doctor candidate at Queen's University's Faculty of Law. He was also editor-in-chief of The Observer at Queen's. He's a former researcher with MLI, once again MLI. He's worked on a broad range of policy areas and of particular interest to me and for our discussion today, including the topic of diaspora politics. He's now working in the House of Commons with two MPs, focusing particularly on immigration policy and government operations policy. He's also intimately involved with the Canada Strong and Free Network's leadership development program, Conservative Values Tomorrow. So, Serge, good to have you, brother.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Takdir Brar. Tak is an historian, political scientist, and researcher. He's a research analyst currently with B'nai B'rith Canada. He's worked previously with the Canadian Embassy in Washington. And just like a Seinfeld episode where there's got to be a common thread, also a vet of Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and also intimately involved with Conservative Values Tomorrow. So, welcome aboard.
Thank you so much. Lively crowd.
All right. So our first topic, we're going to try to cover a bunch of different topics, cover as much ground as we can within a finite period of time. Indo-Pacific. Now, conservatives are all on the same page, and increasingly so are Canadians. China is no longer seen as a basic dictatorship to be admired, but as a hostile actor, a threat. But realistically, given our size, given our trade dependence as a country, given the reality of supply chains, beyond platitudes and loud values declarations, what really, realistically, can Canada do? And also, where does our evolving relationship with India and a changing India fit into the mix here? Why don't we start with Tak?
Yeah, no, great question. I think what we need to do is confront China. Enough playing games with them. I think they need us more than we need them, and so how we do that is simply start by decoupling. And when it comes to the question of India, I think one of the important things that we can work with India is that they see China as a threat just as we see it, but they see it on kind of a borderline in a geographic region. A lot of Indian troops have been getting killed in the demilitarized zone, and China is increasingly encroaching. I think we can work with them as a partner to really isolate China in Asia, in Southeast Asia.
Now, we don't even have an investment protection agreement with India. This is something we've been working on for some time. Yes, we can work with them. How do we kickstart that into action?
Well, I think there's a lot of issues with the current government and the government of India. I think a lot of it has to do with, I think on the Indian side, a lot of the issue comes with Khalistani extremist cells here in Canada, and the Indian government wants us to kind of confront that issue. We could work with them on that and give them an olive branch and really start using that as kind of a domino effect. And it's in their self-interest to work with us, right? China's rising. China wants to grow. China wants a confrontation. They want to change the world, right? And reshape it in their vision. And India's right there. Mm-hmm. And so why don't we just work together, right? It's in our common self-interest. Let's confront China. Let's make a play.
Okay, Melissa, China has been in the news, let's just say, quite a bit.
Yeah, we had a week.
Yeah, recently.
We had a
Would
week.
love to get your views generally on all things Indo-Pacific, China, India, the region, changing geopolitical environment, and so on.
Yeah, look, I'll bring it back to, I think, what we saw from the government for the first time in a very long time. They brought forward an Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, it's arguable that it's more than pieces of paper and really wide-eyed views, but the realization that we are so behind on it is something that, frankly, even this government recognizes. And there is, I did find one good thing in it. I always try to find the one piece is that they've actually called out, Beijing for what it is now, and that's very clearly in the strategy. But just like everything else, it's and for Canada and for any government and for any bureaucracy this size, it's about implementation and what we're actually going to do. And I'll probably come back to this, but there is one thing that we have here, and there is one thing that we don't use in terms of our relationship. And I think it has to be central to our foreign policy, and that's our energy. We are endowed with resources. And if you're looking at economies, big five economies in the Asia Pacific region, we're a Pacific trading nation. You just had Japan go somewhere else for LNG. Right? They came knocking. Either they went to the UAE or Qatar for a good 14-year agreement. We've got this stuff in the ground. And we're not building terminals. And if we doubled Kitimat, which I understand is possible, which is coming online, we can be a major player. And we can be a major player with like-minded democracies. And I think that we haven't had a vision in, I think, our own foreign policy and the way that we behave on the world stage. And we haven't had anything to bring to the table. We've had nice words and a strategy without implementation, without the resources to actually make it true. And we've never really put our money where our mouth is. And I think that's an ideological thing with this government. And I think it'll be very different with the next government.
All right, now, some would beg to differ. The government would say, well, what are you talking about, Melissa? We just launched an Indo-Pacific strategy. We just launched a critical mineral strategy. So what's lacking in this?
You made announcements, right? Mm-hmm. But again, like everything else, with any strategy that we see, there's no talk of implementation. So the devil's going to be in the details and how this stuff actually works. And there's no actual resources dedicated to anything in that strategy. So I think our partners are happy to see their names splashed over, 22 pages a number of times. But beyond that, there's nothing there. So I think it's, you can't sit at every table, and I think one of our next questions will probably touch on that. You've got to pick the tables that you sit at more carefully.
Tak.
Yeah, just to get on that, what policy are we seeing? Are we really confronting China? But no, they're not here. We're not doing anything to confront China. It's all wish-wash. There's police stations here, right? They're interfering in our elections. They're actively trying to undermine us. They're attacking us. And what's the policies? Nothing. So it's time for the politicians, it's time for the elite to really think about the everyday Canadian, because everyday Canadians see China as a threat. They want to confront them. So it's time. It's not enough for talking. It's about let's do something about it.
There's a couple things on the security front, and that's where I think the energy security comes in, and I think it's joining the quadrilateral security dialogue, which we are nowhere to be seen in, and AUKUS, which you just saw meet without Canada even there. Submarines, we have them. We also have the most coastline in the world, so it's unfathomable that we wouldn't be invited to these tables, and it's because we're not a major player. It's because we don't have an implementation strategy, and it's because we haven't put the resources into to backing up a policy document.
Well, from what I heard, from what I've been told, it's just a submarine deal, so we shouldn't worry about it. Yeah.
Well,
all right, look, another very important arena I'd like to hear your views on is the Middle East and the broader region around the Middle East. Now, whole lot to discuss here. Let's start with this one. Conservatives have traditionally been pretty solid in their support for Israel. But is this approach too black and white? We've seen different trends recently with the Netanyahu government, arguably trend towards more hardline approach to politics. Is there room for nuance? And a related question, thinking in terms of Canada, elections, outreach, how do conservatives appeal to a growing number of Arab and generally Muslim immigrants? Is it realistic or is it prudent to say, look, we're happy with the Jewish vote, let other parties compete for everybody else? I'd love to get some views on that. Maybe Kaveh, we can start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So you asked whether or not we need more nuance in our thinking about Israel. So nuance on the one hand is a very good thing, seeing shades coming up with creative policy, that's always very good. But sometimes nuance is kind of a euphemism for backing down on your principles or being flexible in your principles, and that's obviously not something that ought to drive our policy. Our policy, I hold this antiquated notion that our values should drive our policy, and our values should be, obviously standing up against anti-Semitism, the oldest hatred in the world. Our values ought to tell us that we ought to defend Israel's right to exist as a country and its right to defend itself like any other country. These are issues. Yeah. There is frankly no nuance on that. I mean, these are starting principles. But as conservatives, I mean, there is a commitment to certain institutions and certain ways of doing things. So I think what ought to drive our Israel position is the fact that we're not going to bend on those core principles, but we are going to treat Israel like we would France, like Brazil, like India, like any other country. And if we see what's happening in Israel right now, where those institutions and norms of democracy are being weakened, we ought to speak up the way we would if this was happening in any other country. So I think that's the thing that ought to drive us with respect to our Israel policy. Maybe I'll come back to your vote question and maybe get somebody
sure.
else.
And Serge, I'd love to get you in on this as well. And I'll throw in an additional dynamic. The broader region is evolving, it's changing. It's not just, Israel-Palestine question as it used to be. We've got all kinds of stuff going on now. We've got, for example, the new Saudi-Iranian deal, brokered by no less by China. We've got Syria that's emerging now as a vassal state of Russia. So the whole landscape is changing there. But over to you, Serge.
So I think the way we can look at it is, I think, what Kaveh has already said. Israel is our strongest ally in the region. We have strong strategic interest in keeping them as an ally and making sure that they are well protected, especially given their respect for democracy, rule of law. And given what's happened in Israel recently with the Supreme Court changes, which I think you were alluding to, I think the strength of democratic institutions and governance from our allies are very strong influences upon our counterparts abroad. And I just liken it to like a very mini example of like a friend kind of comes up to you and says, maybe you're doing something wrong. You may have a tendency to want to brush it off, but if many of them start coming up to you, then you start to reconsider. And in the past few days, Prime Minister Netanyahu has kind of softened his approach to the judicial reforms that he's planning. And I think that speaks to the power that democratic countries can have in just shoring up each other and just being of support to each other. And with respect to the broader Saudi-Iran deal, I think keeping Israel secure, safe in light of that is all the more important. So, and yeah, that's what I would say.
Can you unpack the Saudi-Iranian deal a little bit more for us in terms of even global impact?
Well, it depends on, I guess, your worldview. I guess the more neoconservative approach would be thinking that the way that China has sort of inserted itself into the Middle East suggests that we're losing ground of some sort. And we're seeing a general transition of power from the US to China in terms of managing international relations. But on the other hand, I guess one of the central tenets of Chinese foreign policy in the last however many decades has kind of been, we're going to try and reduce problems just so it doesn't affect us. So I think viewed in that light, where it's kind of just, okay, we're going to step ourselves into this particular moment and just remove any sort of potential for greater conflict or greater conflict spread, then you start to realize that maybe that the deal doesn't really have that many broader implications.
Okay. Now, does anybody have any view on the present role of the United States in this arena? Is its voice, is its role diminishing? Do you think we're status quo in that respect? And how does Canada fit in there?
So the U.S. role, unfortunately, does seem to be diminishing. I mean, I think the Iran-Saudi deal, as brokered to some extent by China, attests to that. And I think a lot of that has to do with a very misguided sort of worldview by the current administration. It's one that doesn't recognize who its friends are. It's one that is not committed to democracy in the region. And largely, it's one that has been a little soft, in my view, on dictatorships around the world, and as a result, it finds itself kind of retreating a little bit. And I think that does offer us, as a values-driven country, an opportunity to find places where we can engage with the world. If there is time, I would love to go back to your question about the votes, because I think because you posed a really important question. I think it's worth thinking about, where you said, do we get settle for the Jewish vote or go after the Arab Muslim vote? And I think it's a really important thing to think about when thinking about the Middle East. But I kind of reject the premise of the question a little bit, because it presents this binary where you have to have one or the other, and it presents the Middle Eastern vote as though it's kind of a monolithic vote. I am from that community to some extent, and I will tell you, I mean, certainly in that community there are people who disagree with the values that I laid out about Israel's right to exist and so on. Those are voters that conservatives are never going to get, and frankly, those are voters that conservatives probably shouldn't even seek. But within that community, the Israel issue is probably number 10 on the list of people's concerns. People are concerned on a whole host of other issues. Cost of living. They care about their kids going to school and learning math and science instead of learning about 75 new genders. They care about, they care about immigration. They care about having their credentials recognized. Like, these are issues that we can engage them on. And on foreign policy, there are probably other things they care about beyond the Israel-Palestine issue. So, I come from the Iranian community. I'm very involved in Iran issues. And I will tell you, a few months ago, we had a massive rally in Toronto. 50,000 people showed up to protest for democracy in Iran. The liberals were nowhere to be found. But you know who was there? Pierre Poilievre was there, and my friend Melissa Lantzman was there. And I will tell you, MP Lantzman, you managed to win over a lot of voters that day because you cared about the issue that those Middle Easterners cared about beyond Israel-Palestine. So there's a lot that we can do to engage those voters to win them.
Do you want to jump in on this one?
Look, I'll jump in terms of, there is there is going after vote share and all of that. And if you look at the world in sort of a narrow cast view of everybody in every different community equals a vote, probably not a great way to live. But there is the difference between right and wrong. And that's as conservatives, those are the values that we would seek in any kind of foreign policy, in any kind of decision making that we would make. There is a regime in Iran that is this is the government of feminist foreign policy. You would think that a revolution started by women, led by women, and then young people, and then women and men, and then everybody who wants to see that regime go away. You would think that they knew the difference between right and wrong. You would think that they understood that protecting communities here and the diaspora communities here, not as voters, but as our neighbors and as our friends, as people we went to school with and as people we work with, do not want to live in fear of regime activists who are here. And there is the difference between doing the right thing and the wrong thing. And we continue to do the wrong thing when we have the opportunity to do the right one.
Hear, hear.
Awesome. Now,
I'm good on Israel, though.
No, this is good.
Yeah, I'm good on Israel.
Now, I'm going to riff off your comment that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's talk about the war in Europe. Canada obviously picked the right side rather than siding with the likes of Belarus and Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela, right? The countries backing Putin. And with good cause. This is a clear-cut case of naked, barbaric aggression against a sovereign neighbor minding its own business. Now, what keeps me up at night, though, is that despite the global coalition, the international coalition supporting Ukraine, there is a growing serious threat of a fringe right, pro-Putin sentiment. We see it creeping into the U.S. Republican caucus. We hear full-on, blatant Kremlin propaganda from people like Tucker Carlson regularly. How do we halt that creep of Kremlin propaganda into the Canadian right? How did we get from being the party of Stephen Harper and John Baird, I'm going to look you in the eyeballs and say you're going to get out of Ukraine? How do we get from there to an awkward kind of silence? How do we refocus on our traditional role as conservatives as being the stalwarts of a principle-based foreign policy? Kaveh?
Great question. And we were backstage and I was telling you this is a conservative gathering and I'm painfully nonpartisan, but I'm here to implore you as conservatives not to go down this path of isolationism and giving in to this Tucker Carlson, Russian propaganda. There is this current, which had traditionally been on the left, but now seems to be moving to the right, of wanting to withdraw from the world, saying moral equivocation. I'm seeing that everywhere. I think there are a couple of ways that Canada generally and conservatives in particular ought to push back. One is the recognition that what Putin does abroad, we can't isolate ourselves from that. What Putin does abroad actually, what dictatorships do abroad, actually affects us here. So we see that right now playing out with China. China's dictatorship is not just a problem over there, it is now becoming a problem for us here. And it's the same thing with Russia and a lot of other bad actors internationally. So this is the argument that we ought to make, is that isolation doesn't actually protect us from these dictatorships. And secondly, I think part of the appeal of people like Putin is that he projects himself as though he is a paragon of masculinity and traditional values and so on. All these things are false, but we do see a certain degradation in our values here in the West. Earlier I made a joke about schools not teaching math and science, but that stuff actually I think has an effect where people look at their institutions and see that they're failing, and suddenly things abroad look, the propaganda from abroad resonates a little bit more. And so we ought to be fighting for our institutions here, and I think if we're successful in that fight, the model offered by the Putins of the world will be a lot less attractive as a result.
All right. Serge.
Yeah, I agree fully with what Kaveh just said. I think that the way in which we've sort of looked at the gradual rise of Russian propaganda, especially among like the conservative right in the United States and Canada, is also very concerning. And I think it's useful to just resist the subversion of conservatism by Vladimir Putin. I think that's the most central thing we have to do. And there's, I remember reading this article by two Chinese scholars at Fudan University. And one of the things that they wrote about was how Putin uses conservatism as a tool just to elicit sympathy from any sort of like similarly based parties in both Europe and the United States. And he uses that, he picks on those sympathies, highlighting things in speeches. He mentions them in speeches, things like, oh, the West allows multiple genders, oh, the West does this to their families. And the moment he does that is purely to get into the minds of any sort of conservative voters here and make them think that, oh, there's our champion over there in Moscow. And I think the moment we start to realize that it is being used as a tool against us rather than as a tool that's meant to sort of support this sort of conservative movement overseas, we can start to reject it and we can start to fight back against it. We have to redefine conservatism properly here.
Yeah, it's quite the irony, isn't it? The former Bolshevik KGB chief now using conservatism as a cudgel. Yeah, Tak, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, one thing I think in our conversations, what we're noticing is we are seeing a spike in threats, right? We're seeing a Middle East kind of getting divulged with this new Saudi Arabia alliance. We're seeing India being confronted as well. We're seeing Canada being attacked on multiple fronts, internal and domestically, as well as outside. But I think we need to all be very aware of who the real threat is and who's behind this new kind of block that threatens our livelihoods. I think China is who we need to focus on. I think China is the enabler, it's the organizer, it's the influencer, and and they are actively trying to destroy our lives every day. So I think our foreign policy needs to. I think there's a very big disconnect between the average Canadian and I want to say this again, and the elites. And I think it's time for them to kind of reflect our concerns, our safety issues, and really go after kind of the leader of the pack, which is China. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think we should take this threat very seriously. And I think they should be aware that, Canadians and people in the West are willing to sacrifice their lives, and we've shown it in history, time and time again, to keep the flame of liberty alive throughout the darkness that evil and dictatorships pose. So I think they should be aware of that. I think we should be more vocal in terms of confronting them, and yeah, that's what I have to say.
Awesome. We could probably keep going all day on this, but there's another really important basket of issues that I really want to hear from you on. Friendshoring, free trade, multilateralism, mini-lateralism,
All the
Five
words.
Eyes,
All the words.
all the good ones. Look, the big awakening of the last decade has been the globalization. And look, let's acknowledge it. Conservatives traditionally were the big champions of free trade, but there's the big realization that globalization naively went too far. And it has led to the hollowing out of entire industrial sectors, entire regions, just to shave a couple pennies off the bottom line by going to a cheaper Chinese knockoff in the supply chain. And fast forward a few decades, it's like, wow, we've done some real damage to ourselves, while at the same time enriching and emboldening the very actors who are now having the last laugh and are fueling a revamped authoritarianism. So what's the future of global trade, of globalization generally? Is it going to be a more selective view of with whom we do business? Do you see us going down a road of mini blocks of like-minded countries? Is multilateralism dead? on either a global trade front or even on a multilateral, like UN, World Trade Organization kind of scale of institutional multilateralism? I know there's a lot there, so who wants to kick it off? Melissa, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah?
So I'll go back to. So when the Liberals won in 15, they were going to go back to Canada's place in the world, and we're back, and the whole podium with multilateralism being being the core of their policy. We're going to sit at every table, and we're going to follow these UN goals, and we're going to change this, and 15% of our policy will be feminist foreign policy, and this, and that. And it turns out that most of that didn't come to fruition because there's a new president a year into their term, and they got to go back to the drawing board, and we've got to, it's our job to have a good relationship with the White House, no matter who's in the White House, no matter who is the Prime Minister here. That is our primary job as a next door neighbor. But what I think lacks in all of that is a vision to bring it all together. Like, what are we doing at those tables? Why are we at all of them and not some of them? And what is it that we have that the world wants that can do two things: make the lives of Canadians better, make our, from an economic perspective, and from a job creation perspective, and from a livelihood perspective, and not just from Alberta, right across the country. And what does the world want, and how do we displace the dictators of the world, and how they are profiteering to fund either their movements or their wars, and that is oil and gas. And that is, we haven't taken our own energy security seriously, and we haven't used it as a tool of foreign policy. We have, look, TMX is a disaster. It's a $30 billion disaster. They rolled over on Keystone. Not only did they roll over on Keystone, but the Prime Minister was invited and accepted a state dinner after he rolled over on Keystone. The neglect in the U.S.-Canada relationship on oil means that Biden's getting, Biden's talking about increases in production, and Canada's not at the table. It means 600,000 barrels of oil from Venezuela to, from Chevron into the U.S. instead of clean Canadian oil. And I get it. Like, we are not going to have oil one day. We are going to be off of the stuff one day. But the last barrel of oil ever produced in the world should be a Canadian barrel. And that's an advantage to us. And it's an advantage to our values and our foreign policy. Look, we are not getting stuff built here. We have an ideological government that's opposed to it. We have, to use a term of the next Prime Minister of Canada, the gatekeepers are in the way. But if you look in the North Sea, in 194 days, Germany built an LNG terminal. Not only built, but got the permits for, got the plans for, and actually built, and it is operational. 194 days. I don't know, it's like 5, 6, 7 years here.
Is it naive and a lost opportunity to not use our natural resources in our foreign policy?
Yeah, I think, like, we got it, right? We got it, the world wants it, and we know the world wants it. They came here last summer begging for it. We turned them away. Something business case. We turned them away, they got it from somewhere else. We could be displacing the evil dictator oil of the world. We can be enriching the lives of Canadians. We can we can ensure that it's our ethical, clean oil that is being used around the world. That's what I think. That's what others would want from us, and that's how we get a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that reminds me. It reminds me of a rally outside the Ukrainian embassy the night before the bombs started to fall. Pierre Poilievre stood there outside the Ukrainian embassy and said, "For heaven's sake, Canada has the natural gas to feed a hungry Germany."
Absolutely.
And we haven't done it.
Got a lot of it.
Let's get you in here. Future of trade, future of global trade, future of multilateralism.
Yeah, just one of the things that I would propose is I think we should incentivize a new block I would say countries like Great Britain, the United States, Japan, Australia, and Canada should be leading the way of the future and really confronting this new China-led pack. And just to jump on MP Lanceman's point about oil and gas, my favorite thing about the Liberal government and the Democrats in the United States is that, Canada is not allowed to produce our own natural resources or our own oil and gas, but let's let Biden shut down our pipelines. It's not even taking our oil and gas, and Canada needs to lead the way on combating global emissions, while China and India are leading the way, still building coal plants, right? And then what does the Democratic government, what does Joe Biden do? Well, Canada, you need to shut down, you need to cut your emissions, you need to go green, but I'm going to open up the biggest oil field and gas field in Alaska. So that's not a friendship right there, right? That's, I think, frankly, disrespectful.
No.
So I think that's something we should be well aware of, and
I want to
something
pull on one of your threads
them.
here. You mentioned working with the U.S., Great Britain, Australia, others. Sounds like you don't think that AUKUS is just a submarine deal.
Well, I think AUKUS is kind of a wake-up call to Canada and to this Liberal government, is that you guys have a problem with hostile regimes in your country. You're not trusted by your allies with sensitive intelligence. You're not trusted by your allies to confront issues that they see as threats. You're always late to the game. So as a punishment, we're going to keep you out of our security deals. Mm-hmm. We're not going to give you new nuclear subs because we don't trust you. Because why? You guys have a China problem. You have an Iran problem. You have a Russia problem. If we give you our sensitive military technology, it's going to go to the other side.
Is AUKUS the new Five Eyes? Is it the inner circle within the Five Eyes?
Yeah, because look at what happened with New Zealand. New Zealand was the same issue. They kicked New Zealand out. They kicked Canada out. And why is Australia there? Because Australia has been actively confronting China, and they've been at the battleground. Despite, you can say they go from the left government to the right government. Before COVID, they were getting crippled by the Chinese and sanctions, from their natural resources to their wines, to their poultry, because they saw China as just invading them domestically. There's Chinese spies everywhere. They're taking up their natural resources. And one day they woke up and they said, we have to confront this issue.
Kaveh.
I think Zach largely stole my thunder. He said it well. He alluded to the fact that we have a China problem, a Russia problem, an Iran problem. I would argue that this is all the same problem, right? Earlier you talked about the China brokered deal in the Middle East, or Syria becoming a vassal of Russia. What you're beginning to see in the world, more and more, and it's becoming very clear, is that there is kind of this alliance of dictatorships coming together, right? Russia, China, Syria, Iran, Venezuela, these countries coming together. And we ought to recognize it all as one general threat, and the response to it is for us to be more engaged with our allies, with like-minded countries. Yep. And when we see that we're actually not at the table with our allies because they don't trust us, because we don't take the Chinese threat very seriously, that's a real problem, and that actually weakens us in response to all these threats. So really, we ought to be shaping up. We ought to be taking these threats more seriously and working much more closely with our democratic allies to be able to push back on this.
We also need some stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does this? Well, yeah. What does this mean for trade?
I think that's a different panel, but not trade. But we need some military equipment. We don't have the kit. So that's afternoon.
And there's a whole new discussion about military spending: 1.3% GDP, 2% GDP, the big delta in between.
But that's a big deal.
Yeah.
No, just to jump on MP Lanceman's point. I think it's not about militarization, about building a military-industrial complex. It's not that. let's build some Canadian capacity. Let's build some Canadian submarines, some Canadian jets. And why? The question is like, why do we need these, TAC? Well, the question is, we're going to create good paying, high quality jobs for everyday Canadians. Instead of having to get a PhD and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in graduate school fees, you know, a worker, a tradesman, an entrepreneur, a secretary, a plumber, a welder can get high-paying jobs and provide food for their families. Like that's why we need to build our military up. We can provide good jobs for every Canadian without having to go to graduate school. So I think that's one of the important jobs.
For sure. You'd be good at question period, but I didn't say military complex.
Serge, go ahead, Serge.
For the reporters in the back.
I think broadly in the past several years, we've kind of seen a subversion of our general national interests by the Liberal government. Back in the 1950s, we used to be considered the bridge between Europe and North America and the United States. We were that bridge. We had that connection with the United Kingdom. We had that connection with France through Quebec. And we just allowed that to get subverted by short-term political goals, and such as like the feminist foreign policy initiatives, such as a lot of the foreign aid sort of initiatives that we've put up. And the sooner we kind of come to terms with who we are as a country and what sort of things we want to stand for in the world, only then can we actually make a difference, because right now it's looking like a hot mess.
All right, but just final point on this topic, though. What does that mean for trade? Do we stop trading with China? Is that realistic?
Yes. I say yes.
And what kind of a horizon is required to shift trade relationships?
I think decoupling, working with our allies, and confronting them, and creating domestic jobs. Why are we importing jobs when we can do it here?
Okay.
Right?
That was a rich discussion. One final topic, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. We'll have to go pretty quickly, but I'd really love to hear from all of you. Arctic, circumpolar. This is our own backyard. This is our own hinterland, which is a vast store of critical minerals and increasingly, and particularly in the future, the fastest shipping route between all major trade blocs in the world. We have traditionally been woefully neglectful of monitoring the North, defending this global frontier that's closest to home. How do we tackle the North? What do we need to do better? And how do we do that? All right. Rapid round. Let's start with Kaveh.
Great question. I have to admit this is a little bit outside my area of knowledge, but a lot of my colleagues at MLI do a lot of thinking on this. And what they recommend is, first of all, we need to get our act together in terms of actually having a whole of government approach on this issue, which we currently lack. And also just working as we've been, this has been the running theme throughout discussion, working more closely with our allies that are like-minded, recognizing the threat from Russia and China in the Arctic, working, for example, with the United States to strengthen NORAD, and also, there's an Arctic Council with which we are not terribly engaged, and we ought to be more engaged there, and we ought to recognize that this is going to be the future battleground and focus on it much more than we are doing currently.
All right. Tak.
Back to me again. I think we need to, exactly what Kaveh said, I think at the beginning, we need to pull our weight, and we need to build, because I frankly don't think there's anything, we don't even have any capability to do anything there. And what do you think, the Americans are going to do it? Like, why are we waiting for other people to act? We need to step up to the plate and actually do something about it. Let's build some nuclear Arctic like icebreakers and stuff like that. Let's rebuild NORAD, because I don't even think there's any capability left, because they let a balloon come in. So if they can't even deal with the balloon, what are they going to deal? What are they going to do with when a fighter jet crosses or a missile, right? So.
Yeah.
All right, you know what? Soundbite of the day.
Not wrong. Not wrong.
Soundbite of the day goes to Tak. If they can't even deal with a balloon. All right, Serge.
I think I'll disagree just a tiny bit about the role of the Americans. I think in history we've been able to see us kind of work with the Americans, especially back in the early 1900s, on just our waterways. And right now, I think Tak pointed out very correctly that we do need all these sort of high quality equipment and submarines and all that sort of stuff to go into the Arctic. But because we don't have it right now, I think there is a role for the Americans. We can assert our sovereignty over the Arctic and work with them on whatever they need from the Arctic. This can be a dual sort of mission that we have, and that deepens the relations within our countries.
And let's build it here. Why are we not building them here? Why are we not building them in Sherbrooke, Quebec? Why are we not building them in BC? Why are we not building them in Halifax, Nova Scotia? We have the capabilities. We don't need to provide other countries jobs. We can do it here. Put it in the agreement.
Melissa.
I'll end on a good story, because we used to pay attention to this, and I had the honor of working with our Minister of Foreign Affairs in the last government, and when Stephen Harper came to power, there was like somebody had like called the Arctic desk at DFATE, and they dusted off the phone. They're like, "Hello, nobody's ever called us," because we had sort of Stephen Harper had a look to the Arctic. This guy went there. The Prime Minister went there every summer, and we started paying attention to the North. But we've been a laggard in NATO. I think the contribution to the Western Alliance is a role that we can play. But you're right. We have to build the capacity to get there. We don't have the kit. We don't have the stuff. We don't have the subs. This, NORAD was built at a time where there wasn't hypersonic missiles, and to your point, the balloon thing. There needs to be talk of ballistic missile defense, like the UK is in there. The Americans are now doing joint exercises with the Scandinavians, and we're not invited, and that should be really concerning to us. So it's time to have the real conversation, and that will get us closer to, I think, where we need to be in terms of defense spending, which is that 2%. We're not getting there.
Now, speaking of the Arctic, Melissa, are you thrilled that we were able to solve the Hans Island problem without going to war with Denmark?
I was more thrilled when we found the ship.
Yeah. All right, look, we've got about 1 minute left. Any final words? Canadian foreign policy, what do we need to think about? What do we need to worry about going forward? Go ahead, Tak.
Yeah, I think we really need to focus on China, but I also see I don't think we should be scared or anything like that. I think they are woefully underestimating what we are willing to do and what we will do. And I think history has shown with either the Persians and the Greek city-states, sorry, stealing from my sister, that even though we might be worried domestically about what's going on with CRT and stuff like that, we will, once we're confronted with that, we will focus and get ready to fight. But I also see an opportunity as well. If we are actually facing the recession that everyone is kind of predicting and seeing, I think foreign policy, military build-up can provide those jobs to kickstart that economy. So I think there's opportunity, and China should see us soon.
All right, Serge, your final words?
I think part of understanding how to conduct our foreign policy is trying to really understand who we are and be proud of who we are. I think this is a country where we try not to rely on historical myths too much because of accusations of racism or we're just white supremacy for many of the people on our side. And I think that's just a pure mistake. The moment we're proud of our country, the moment we're proud of the historical achievements in our long history of being a helpful fixer, a middle power, returning to that will be much faster, much swifter, and we'll have a better seat at the table once again very soon.
Kaveh?
I'll pull together all the strands of things I've been talking about. I think for our foreign policy to make sense, we actually have to be clear-eyed about the threats out there and we have to recognize that all these different threats are connected, and we in turn need to connect with our allies and bring something to the table. As Melissa was saying, we need to make a meaningful contribution, and we can only do that if we think seriously about what the threats are. And I don't think we're doing that just yet. But we need to let our values, correct values, guide us, work closely with our allies, and then we can actually make a meaningful contribution.
And the final word goes to Melissa.
Always. Look, I want to see a foreign policy that actually is based on a conservative vision, one of democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law, focused on our own security and what we can give the world, because we've got a lot of it to give, and it's all in the ground.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for a tremendous, tremendous discussion. That was really good, really smart. Now, one final round of applause for our panelists.